Everyone stared and no one said a word. Except my dad, and his words cut deeper than any knife ever could. I remember the day like it was etched in fire. I was 15, standing in the grand living room of our Michigan estate, trembling as my father pointed a finger at me. "This is all your fault," he spat. My sister smirked behind him, enjoying the chaos, while the rest of the family stood frozen, pretending nothing was happening. I had been the scapegoat for every mistake in that house: broken vases, missed deadlines, failed family investments. It didn't matter what it was. Somehow, magically, it was my fault. But that day, something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I made a silent promise. I would never be powerless again. The humiliation was sharp, electric. I could feel the weight of their disdain pressing down on me, and yet a spark ignited in my chest. That humiliation would be my fuel. That injustice would be my blueprint. "If you think I'm weak," I whispered to myself, "watch me rise." That night, I sneaked out of the house, walking past the marble columns of the estate, feeling the cold Michigan wind like a challenge against my past. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew one thing. I would not only survive, I would thrive. No one knew I had a plan. Not my father, not my sister, not even the household staff who whispered about me behind closed doors. After that night, I disappeared from the eyes of my family. I rented a tiny apartment in Detroit, worked 2 jobs, and spent every spare second learning: finance, business, technology. I was invisible to the world, but every humiliating memory fueled my ambition. I wasn't running, I was strategizing. By day, I delivered packages and made coffee for people who didn't care about my dreams. By night, I devoured books on billion-dollar companies, investment strategies, and startup secrets. I scribbled ideas on scraps of paper, dreams that seemed impossible but felt necessary. One evening, I realized something. Every mistake my father had blamed me for, every misstep my sister mocked, came from the same flaw in their empire: arrogance. They underestimated people like me. They underestimated me. And in that underestimation, I found my weapon. I opened a notebook and wrote 3 words in bold: revenge. Wealth. Control. Not for cruelty, not for petty retaliation, but for justice. If they thought I was powerless, I would show them what a powerless child could do. No one saw it coming. Not my father, not my sister, not even my so-called friends. By the time I turned 18, I had saved enough to invest in a small tech startup. Barely noticed, barely funded, but full of potential. I remember the moment I signed the first deal, trembling with excitement. That paper in my hand wasn't just a contract. It was proof that the powerless child could start rewriting the rules. The startup wasn't glamorous. I worked in a cramped warehouse in Michigan, surrounded by flickering fluorescent lights, whiteboards covered with calculations, and a team who didn't know I was the scapegoat from the fancy estate. I hired people who believed in vision, not status. Slowly, painfully, we began to grow. Every challenge reminded me of my past humiliation. Investors laughed at my youth, competitors tried to sabotage our first product launch, and my sister, who I had no contact with, was busy flaunting wealth I didn't yet possess. And yet, with every obstacle, I became smarter, sharper, hungrier. "The taste of small victories is sweeter when you've been crushed for years," I whispered to myself, staring at our first client email confirming the first major deal. That tiny email felt like a revolution. I realized then, the world didn't matter who I was. They only cared about results. And I would deliver them, in ways no one expected. I started to taste power, and they had no idea I existed beyond their shadow. By age 21, my small startup had transformed into a thriving tech company. The same people who laughed at my youth were now begging for meetings, investment proposals, and partnerships. Every challenge I'd faced, every humiliation, every unfair blame, had sharpened me into someone no one could ignore. I remember flying to Chicago for my first major investor conference. The skyline glittered like a promise. I was nervous, yes, but this time it was the excitement of potential, not fear of failure. When I walked into the room, I noticed familiar arrogance in the eyes of older executives, men who had underestimated me. I smiled inwardly. Let them doubt me. That doubt would soon cost them. Back home, my father was still wrapped in his own illusion of superiority. My sister continued to flaunt wealth she didn't earn. Little did they know, I was quietly buying properties, investing in businesses, and setting up a network that would eventually eclipse their empire. I was invisible, yet unstoppable. The higher you climb, the further you can reach those who underestimated you, I thought, as I signed a deal that doubled my company's valuation. That single act of signing a contract, something mundane to anyone else, was my first public mark of independence and power. The first time my father realized I was no longer a child, the look on his face was priceless. It was a Friday afternoon when I returned to Michigan, not as the timid scapegoat, but as a confident young billionaire. My father's estate gleamed under the summer sun, the same place where I had once been humiliated and ignored. My sister lounged by the pool, laughing at some trivial luxury she thought defined her power. I walked through the front doors with my business portfolio in hand, a subtle smile on my face. My father noticed me immediately, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. "I came to discuss some business opportunities," I said calmly. "I think you might want to hear this." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "Business? From you? You've barely made it in the world." That's when I laid it out. Every company I had bought, every partnership I had secured, every investment that had doubled our family fortune in just 2 years. I told him plainly, letting each detail land like a hammer. His smugness faded into shock, then anger, and finally disbelief. My sister's laughter died midair. She tried to mask her panic, but I could see the realization in her eyes. I had outsmarted them both. For the first time, I held the power they had always wielded over me. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been blamed for things you didn't do, imagine the look on their faces when you rise above it, I thought, savoring the moment. While they celebrated life's luxuries, I was quietly rewriting the rules, and no one saw it coming. After that first confrontation, I didn't stop. My father and sister assumed my visit had been a brief triumph, a lucky accident, nothing more. But I had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it was time to act. I began buying shares in the family's companies quietly, using proxies and shell corporations. Every acquisition went unnoticed, every investment strategically placed to gain leverage without drawing attention. By the time my father noticed, I controlled a significant portion of the empire he had once considered untouchable. My sister, still busy flaunting wealth, had no idea her every indulgence was being leveraged against her. She called me for advice on some trivial matter, not realizing the irony that I now had the authority to make her decisions matter or fail. The best revenge, I thought, is the one that looks like luck to everyone else. And that's exactly how it felt when the board called me in for a meeting they thought was routine. I walked into the room, smiled politely, and revealed that I had majority shares. The room went silent. My father's face turned pale, my sister froze mid-sentence, and the staff who had once whispered about my failures now watched in awe. That day, I realized, power isn't about anger. It's about patience, planning, and execution. And I had all three. The headlines didn't just surprise them, they humiliated them. By the time I turned 25, my empire had grown beyond what I ever imagined. Tech companies, real estate, media ventures. I controlled assets that rivaled my father's long-established fortune. But until now, most of my moves had been quiet, almost invisible. That was about to change. I orchestrated a press release announcing my latest acquisition, a controlling stake in the family conglomerate. The news hit like a lightning strike. Financial news outlets ran stories about the young billionaire who had quietly outmaneuvered an entire dynasty. Social media exploded with shock, admiration, and envy. My father called me immediately, voice trembling. How did you?" he stammered. I let him finish, savoring each word. My sister, who had been used to flaunting wealth on Instagram, posted a reaction video that backfired spectacularly. Her followers flooded the comments with disbelief and mockery. For the first time, she realized that influence without substance was meaningless. I watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't stormed in. I had simply executed a plan they never saw coming. And now the world, not just our household, was bearing witness to the truth. I was no longer powerless. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to beg. I just needed them to see reality and feel it. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I invited my father and sister to my office. The invitation was casual, but the stakes were anything but. When they arrived, the room was sleek, modern, and unmistakably mine. The skyline of Detroit stretched behind me through floor-to-ceiling windows, a silent reminder of how far I had come. My father's eyes darted around nervously. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. My sister hovered awkwardly, clutching her designer bag as though it could shield her from the truth. I smiled politely. "This," I said, gesturing around the office, "is the result of years of hard work, strategy, and patience. And this," I added, sliding a folder across the table, "is your inheritance or what remains of it under my control." Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief as they realized the depth of my acquisitions. Every property they owned, every business they thought was untouchable, I now had leverage over. The tables had turned. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's showing someone what they ignored. I thought, watching my father struggle to speak, my sister's pride crumbling. "You taught me to survive in a world that underestimated me," I continued. "Now you'll understand what it feels like to be powerless." I didn't humiliate them with words or insults. I did it with results. Every smirk they once wore at my expense had returned to them tenfold, silent but undeniable. I had finally flipped the script. The moment the world saw the truth, there was no going back for them, or for me. A week after the office confrontation, I orchestrated a public reveal. The press, social media, and business networks were all buzzing. I gave an exclusive interview about my journey from being the family scapegoat to becoming a billionaire in my own right. I shared my struggles, my strategies, and most importantly, the lessons I had learned. Headlines screamed, "Scapegoat to Billionaire, the sibling who outsmarted a dynasty." Interviews, podcasts, and news outlets dissected my story. The twist? I subtly hinted at the family drama, without naming names, but the connections were obvious. My father's empire had been quietly influenced by my acquisitions. My sister's social media missteps made her look petty in comparison. The reaction was electric. The business world applauded my ingenuity. Young entrepreneurs were inspired. And my family, they were humiliated on a scale they had never imagined. People whispered about the arrogant father and indulgent sister who had underestimated a child, now a self-made billionaire. I watched the world react with quiet satisfaction. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had mocked and blamed me were now examples of what happens when arrogance meets underestimation. And I had delivered this lesson flawlessly. They had made me powerless for years, but now, every choice I made reminded them of who I had become. The day I decided to confront my father and sister one final time, it wasn't about money, or titles, or public humiliation. It was about justice, closure, and finally reclaiming the family dignity that had been stolen from me. I invited them to a private gala at one of my properties, a luxurious, sprawling Detroit estate. The room glowed with soft golden light. Influential business leaders, journalists, and friends watched silently, curious about the gathering. My father arrived first, stiff, uneasy. My sister followed, trying to mask her discomfort with a forced smile. I stood at the center of the room and addressed them calmly. For years, I was blamed for mistakes I didn't make. I was ridiculed, ignored, and dismissed. But I didn't let that break me. I built something you thought I never could. I turned your underestimation into my strength. Their faces told the story: disbelief, shame, regret. The staff, who had once watched me suffer silently, now whispered admiration. The tables had turned completely. I handed them both folders with legal documents, full settlements, restructuring plans, and terms that made them realize their old arrogance had cost them their influence. I didn't take pleasure in their humiliation. It was justice served with precision. As the crowd applauded, my father finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I underestimated you." My sister simply nodded, tears welling in her eyes. And at that moment, I knew the cycle had ended. Not with revenge, but with power, strategy, and truth. If you've ever been blamed unfairly or overlooked, remember, patience and strategy can turn your worst moments into your greatest victories. I thought, smiling as the gala lights reflected off the city skyline. From scapegoat to billionaire, from powerless to unstoppable, I had finally rewritten my story, and theirs. If you believe in justice and never giving up, comment yes, and share your story.